Hi, welcome back, everyone. I'm Anya Kadadeglia with the National Post. So keeping up with digital trends, it's hardly new for journalists, but more than ever now, younger generations of Canadians are moving away from traditional platforms for their primary news. And the whole ecosystem of digital platforms available continues to multiply. And with that come new ways to tell stories and present information. So to explore where innovation in storytelling is going, we've assembled a panel of people working at the forefront, both from platforms and publishers. So joining me now are Avneet Dhillon. Avneet is a producer with the CBC News social media and audience team. She currently leads vertical video storytelling on Snapchat Discover. Emily Ann Epstein is the director of content for Narcity Media. Previously, she was the executive news editor for Bustle, a senior editor at The Atlantic, and the managing editor of the New York Observer. Catherine Hudson has spent over 15 years building communities and showcasing dynamic stories, having worked first as a print and digitally focused journalist and editor, and later as a content strategist and consultant. She's now the lead for media partnerships at TikTok in Canada. And Gabriel Sands is a senior partnerships manager at Reddit, where he focuses on news and journalism partners. Previously, he was the marketing director at Refinery 29. So for the first question, I want to start off asking everybody and get all of your opinions on what the new trends in storytelling and news are right now. You know, what are you seeing in 2021? What's new? What's hot? What do we all need to know about?
And I can kick it off. I think that we're seeing the rise of creators, definitely. And with that, I think that user-generated content is coming more and more into the foreground and is being used by a lot of the news and journalism partners that I work with more as a source either for storytelling or, observing broader cultural trends. On Reddit, because the users are generally organized in communities, the output that we see on our platform is particularly unique. And a large part of my role has been to help journalists that are looking to engage with these, social audiences, interact with them in a more meaningful way, and then generate a content output that also has, value for them and their audiences on their platforms.
And I would just add to that, what we've been seeing at CBC News and just more broadly is that young people in particular are turning to social media for their news. Just as an example, Instagram is a platform that started out, people were sharing personal photos and videos, but now increasingly you're seeing people share news on those platforms, infographics. And when there's something in the news, people turn to Instagram stories or Instagram posts to find sort of digestible content that really breaks down a story. And so more people are turning to Instagram, also TikTok. You're seeing those green screen backgrounds with someone explaining a story and really breaking it down for people. So I would say, young people in particular, but also audiences more broadly are turning to these emerging platforms to consume news and really consume it in a more digestible way.
It's so true. When you talk about how our audiences on TikTok are looking for news specifically, and also really more broadly content that informs, that educates, we see such a rabid appetite for that very digestible format. And we have creators across all categories, whether it's food or science, who are creating really interesting educational formats and who are working to build communities around those very niche interests. And more broadly, I think what's important to know about TikTok in this format is that as a platform, we always encourage people to kind of play rather than pose. And that's why the videos we see that are really authentic, really real, really full of personality, even when it relates to news, are the ones that are ultimately very popular. And so if you can layer that in when you're unpacking buzzwords, when you're decoding, the stories that are circulating in the news cycle, I think that's a great way to engage with audiences.
Yeah, I think the big lesson there for me and for us at Narcity Media is that the reason why we're moving to social media is because that's where conversations are happening. That's where the readers are. That's where our audience is. And I think, what we need to learn from this is that there are more tools that people use to communicate with each other that as publishers, we can create content for. We can't just have an Instagram account. We have to start thinking, you communicate with your friends via text message. We can't just send push alerts. We've got to be thinking about how can we create text messages. People are on Slack all day long. We should be thinking about how can we integrate news conversations and our news content into places like Slack. I think the Skim does something very innovative where they actually create a Google Calendar that you can integrate the Skim's content with the very fabric of your day. And I think for young consumers especially, they're not going to seek you out. You have to give them the information they want where they already are.
And I think adding to what Emily said as well, there is, I think, a desire for conversation, not just for discovering the initial news item, but then to discuss it and unpack it together with either folks that they know or that they maybe don't know. But I think that aspect of it is really important. And I think as far as storytelling goes, there's a lot to be gleaned from those second, third day conversations as the audiences kind of digest this information and come to their own conclusions, guiding each other.
It's true. And I think there's often the assumption in some way that it's just a younger audience that expects to engage and to really show up in the comments section. And on TikTok, we find that sometimes the comment section is just as entertaining as the video themselves, and you can lose yourself in there. But we really find that it's broader than that, and that expectation of being part of the story is across all audiences. And we see really interesting multi-generational conversations. We have like grandmas talking with Gen Z and millennials, and that's often where the most layered, the most engaging conversations come from. So I think it's important just to think about that broadly as well across all age groups.
And it really changes depending on the platform too, I will just say. I mean, I've worked with Gabriel before on Reddit AMAs for CBC News where, we've had the host of a podcast in the Unsolved Mysteries subreddit, which is, a more niche category, but has a very active audience base. And I don't think you'll get a more engaged group of people asking questions than in a subreddit like that. And then Instagram is different and Facebook is different, YouTube is different. And so it's really, it varies depending on the topic, but also the platform.
I think what's successful about that, though, is that publishers are starting to identify as creators themselves. There's an expectation of authenticity on each of these platforms where you don't only want to just talk to CBC, you want to talk to the expert from the CBC about that topic. And the better that platforms and publishers can sort of highlight their creators and their influencers that are creating this content, the more effective that's going to be, because you are competing with a grandma, right? You are competing with a teenager who's really great on the trampoline. And you've got to be able to communicate with that same level of trust and candor.
And I'm curious about where newsrooms are putting their focus right now as well in terms of 2021. So I wanted to hear from you, Avneet, and Emily, you touched on this, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to add. What are your priorities right now in 2021?
I would say for CBC News, especially for digital and social, our focus is really on our audience. How can we best serve our audience? What are the questions that they're asking? How can we answer them in a way that reaches them in the best possible way? And not only how do we get their attention, but how do we keep their attention? So it's one thing to click into a story, but how do we keep them reading? How do we keep them watching or listening, whatever the particular treatment we have for a story? And we even have a dedicated team called CBC Ask, where you can email COVID at CBC with COVID-related questions or ask at CBC. And our team has sent tens of thousands of responses. So that's a personalized email you get with an answer to your question, which is really like some of the best of public broadcasting, in my opinion. But yeah, audience engagement is definitely the key priority for us, but particularly for digital and social. And I will just say for social, I think as long as I've worked on the social and audience team at CBC, which has been probably about 5 or so years now, our focus has always been, don't bury the lead. Tell the audience immediately why they should care about a story. You shouldn't have to get to the 4th paragraph in an article to understand why it's important or why you should care. And also the same thing for video or audio, we should hear or see the reason why right away.
On our end at Narcity, I think, it's sort of the same thing with our central mantra and our core belief about our content is that our readers live in the most interesting place in the world. And so in addition to offering them articles about their local communities, we're really ramping up our live journalism coverage with original videos and storytellers on the ground experiencing the things that people are talking about. On top of that, we're creating original social programming and creating memes and creating GIFs and creating videos in the vernacular of what our readers are already creating for their colleagues. But the third thing that we're really focusing on is transforming our websites and our apps into a true representation of what we call the digital downtown. If you want to find out what's happening in your city, we want to create an environment on our platforms where it can feel like you're walking down Main Street and you can see, what is the cool local shop that everybody's waiting outside of? What's the food that you can smell that you've got to turn around and stop and get that reservation or that amazing burrito? And so it's these three different mediums that, obviously we talk about as publishers, but how can we transform the mission of our website into many different content forms and use every medium of storytelling that is available to create that experience and that sensation for our audience?
And Gabriel, you touched on this earlier, which is user-generated content. Sometimes we call it citizen journalism. So this is a question for whoever wants to jump in. What kind of role is user-generated content or citizen journalism playing in, the news content, news outlets right now? And how do we ensure that we maintain good journalism and incorporate, citizen journalists as well?
I think on Reddit it's taking a lot of different forms. Avni mentioned Unresolved Mysteries, which is a very popular community. They go into a lot of detail, but Redditors are actually solving mysteries all the time as a group. Like someone will find like a strange piece of metal like in a field, and then they'll together identify what it was. They've actually solved crimes before. I think it was like a hit and run car accident, and they like found an identifying piece of the car and then all kind of got into it together and figured that out. So I think that is a very practical example, one that, may make it onto like a local news broadcast, but often, just stays on Reddit. A large part of what I've been trying to do, as I mentioned before, is also enable the journey of the content from our platform to other platforms where there are other audiences that would enjoy it. And part of, I guess, I'm not going to say that I've been successful in my own role in that. There's always more to do, but we have seen, a nice uptick there. And I think that with a platform like Reddit, it's really just a matter of knowing where to look. Because there is so much information on the platform and it's organized differently than a lot of the other more profile-centric platforms. So that's some of what we've been seeing, but I think the beauty of platforms like Reddit or TikTok, and I'm not sure if you say this at TikTok, but we say it at Reddit, that whenever we come out with a new product or a new feature, our users always have many more creative applications for it than we could have ever imagined. So I think that's part of the fun as well, is building new products and creating new communities and opportunities for users, but then seeing what they do with it and how they get creative with it on their own and take it to the next level.
Absolutely. And I would say that, at TikTok, we see individual creators have a really interesting role in, the news cycle and in creating kind of informational, educational content. We often see creators across Canada who are sharing these very honest, very personal, informative accounts of their lives. There's doctors who have been talking about the exorbitant price of groceries in their northern community. There's a woman who was living at a Gananoque residence talking what it feels like to turn 101. And I think that sharing those direct lived experience helps inform the worldview of Canadians. And I also spent years as a journalist. I understand how long it takes to sometimes get a source to open up to you in that very human, honest, open way. But because on TikTok, people often feel that they're speaking directly to a community of their peers, that kind of honesty is really built into the process. And the way that can serve news outlets and journalists is it allows you to connect with sources, of course, but also really get a sense of what the community issues are, how people are feeling about them, what issues are rising to the surface in certain communities. And I think being rooted in that honesty is sometimes how we now see that there's a story in The Atlantic about vaccines that's citing TikTok as one of the original sources, which is maybe not something anyone would have expected 2 years ago.
I think what you're really touching on, though, is, how does journalism fit into user-generated content, right? Like, what is our role if these conversations are originating on other platforms? And what's great about journalism is, the trick is, can we apply journalism to those conversations? Can we figure out for our readers who these creators are, what their background is, if what they said is true? What other context can we add to it? And it's one of those really exciting things. And what, Gabriel and I work on is, we say like, hey, there is this thing that everyone's talking about on Reddit. Can we connect to the people who are at the heart of the story? Can we interview them? Can we add more context? And it's just this endless source of inspiration that all we have to do is apply journalistic principles to these conversations, and we can illuminate the world.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's also why one of my core functions at TikTok is to make sure that we also have these, important journalistic outlets on the platform as well. So we work with, APTN News directly is on the platform now, CTV News, and so they can bring their expertise directly to the audience in that way too.
It's also a great way to tackle disinformation, right? I mean, so much gets shared on social media, and I think particularly for us on Snapchat Discover, because we have a younger demographic, our core demo is between the ages of 17 and 24, although people as young as 13 are consuming our content on Snapchat Discover. If there is a video floating around and we want to verify if it's real or not, there's an opportunity for a story there, and not just a story, but we actually have an opportunity to educate our audience. Here's how to spot disinformation. Can you tell the difference between a real image and a fake image? So there's a great opportunity there too that is sort of a different kind of storytelling. And I will also just say, in terms of user-generated content, we've noticed on Snapchat that as much as, really high quality videos and photos are really essential for storytelling, sometimes a grainy cell phone video can be just as strong as a story. It depends on what the story is. Like, content is king. And depending on what the angle is, what the person's perspective is. And to the point Catherine mentioned earlier as well, it allows you to display a more diverse range of voices, right? We want to reflect the audience that we're serving. And we notice that people consume our content more if they see themselves reflected in it.
And I was going to also ask about misinformation. It's something that obviously we hear a lot about. It's a concern. So how should we be dealing with misinformation on platforms, online in general? I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to add to that.
I can speak to that. We have community guidelines that, prohibit misinformation really regardless of intent. And that's a very important part of being part of the TikTok community. And really, we just work every day to make sure that any misinformation is removed from the platform swiftly. For example, during the pandemic, we put a lot of resources into making sure that any misinformation about COVID-19 was removed within 24 hours of being uploaded. And more equally as important, I would say, is also making sure that we have sources of verifiable, trustworthy information for our audiences. So we have a partnership now with This Is Our Shot. So, Canadians on the platform can get really trustworthy information about COVID. And, that's one way of combating misinformation as well.
On the Reddit side, we certainly also have a content policy, and we enforce it accordingly. On Reddit, we say that we have layered moderation. So we have the top level, Reddit content policy, which is enforced by, we have an anti-evil team that, among other things, enforces that content policy. But then on a subreddit level, subreddits also have their own rules. It can be as simple as, no photos of dogs in the cat subreddit, or they can be much more specific than that. And the fun thing about Reddit is that the communities can be as specific as the community leaders, moderators want them to be, and the moderators can enforce those rules as they see fit. And then there is an additional layer, which is the fact that all posts and comments on Reddit can also be voted on up or down, and the number of net upvotes that a post or comment has affects how it is ranked and therefore sorted when a user is going to look at it. So what we often find is that when there is poor quality content, either because it is untrue or low effort or otherwise deemed unlikable, it will often be downvoted very heavily to the point where it actually falls to the bottom of the page and sometimes even visually collapses, where you have to click into it if it has less than -2 upvotes. So there is a high degree, I think, of quality control that is also kind of happening all the time, by virtue of, these communities making these determinations together. But we also rely on, external partners and resources to be able to enforce that. Reddit's a 15-year-old platform. There are a lot of people on it, of course, and we're a relatively, small company in relation to the size of our user base. So there's always more work to be done with evolving the content policy as content itself evolves on the platform, and then making sure that we're enforcing it, in swift and effective ways.
And I will just add, for CBC News, we're really lucky that our social team, we have staff who are assigned as social media presenters, and part of their job is to engage with our audience, and that includes in the comment section. And I think oftentimes, comment sections are looked at as this just cesspool of hate and trolls and bots, and sometimes it can be, but there are spaces where constructive conversations are happening, and spaces where our audience is actually looking for more information and asking questions. So we have social media presenters who are in there responding to people and finding where those constructive conversations are happening and can actually be productive. And then also looking at where, we need more moderation in the comment sections.
I think what's sad about all of this, though, is something that we all know, is that a lie spreads 1,000 times faster than the truth. And no matter how quickly we take down misinformation or we issue a correction, it's never going to necessarily reach the entire audience that it, initially infected. And I think what really needs to come about, besides moderation, besides layers of upvoting and downvoting, is a healthy dose of skepticism. Anytime you approach a story as a journalist, you have to ask yourself, why is this true? Where does this information come from? What sort of splinter of truth is buried within this story, within this, narrative? And I'm hoping that with, education and with, younger generations really experiencing more ideas and more opinions and more people than any generation before them, that skepticism in a healthy way can help us all, organize the world around what we believe and what is true.
I think there will never be any substitute for the human touch to an extent at some point in the process. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned the word skepticism. I would say that probably no one is more skeptical than a Redditor. This is, they are not inclined to believe pretty much anything until it is proven. This is why AMAs actually require physical proof, the talent holding a sign to verify that they are who they say they are. Of course, there are a million different ping pong balls bouncing around all the time. But yeah, I think I totally agree that when we're being inundated with information and content at the scale that we are, approaching that with a critical mindset, especially for journalists, because then journalists are going to be seen as, operating on a higher level than the average user, that diligence becomes even more important.
Absolutely. And I think it also presents a great opportunity for journalists to, take part in the conversation directly, whether that's, like Avneet said, joining into the comments and not dismissing them as, wasted opportunity, taking them as an opportunity to have meaningful conversations with your audience in every place, which we see is such a key part of success on TikTok for individual creators or for media brands. And journalists, and also just for journalists themselves to, on TikTok, we see journalists who open the doors to their experience, to their life, to share the background, to share the work that goes into actually reporting a story, and invite audiences into that process to acknowledge the work that they're doing, is really resonates with the community too.
And another one that I wanted to throw out to everybody, which is, a lot of online platforms aren't designed for news, right? Sometimes it seems like they're designed to distract, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We're in a pandemic. Sometimes you can't take more pandemic news. You just need to look at some memes or whatever. But there's also the issue of algorithms and filter bubbles, right? That people go on these platforms, they like certain things, and then all they get is stuff that's similar to what they've already liked, and that can create a bit of an echo chamber. So considering all of these things, I guess, how do we make sure that the news that people are getting online is still good journalism or balanced journalism or has a diversity of viewpoints?
I can speak to the way we do it at TikTok. I think really what you're talking about, the filter bubble, is something that is ingrained in the heart of the TikTok experience. When you open the app, I'm not sure how many of us are, all on platform, hopefully everyone, but when you open the app, you quickly start getting this very personalized stream of content that is what you are engaging with, what you're liking, what you're sharing. And it does feel very unique. It feels very bespoke. Everyone's For You page is different, and it really caters to your interests. And it feels so wonderful and personal in that way. But there is always in that process content that is brought to you that is outside of your interest scope, that is like essentially designed to surprise, delight, bring you content that you wouldn't come across, exactly for the reason of making sure that people don't get stuck in that echo chamber, for all the reasons that we know that might be bad, but also just because it's a wonderful human experience to be surprised. And that is such a, wonderful, positive feeling. And so that's part of the TikTok experience is not falling into that filter bubble. And I think that's why people end up ultimately coming across so many diverse pieces of content as a user, and also why it's been such a great platform for brands, because you get your stories out in front of audiences that would fundamentally never come across them any other way.
We've definitely seen that on Snapchat Discover, I will say, which is a platform where you also have a Discover page or For You page, you could call it. And even if you're not subscribed to CBC News, you'll see one of our headlines or images come up. And it's just a matter, again, of how are we writing that headline and what are we using to pull people in? If that's strong enough, even though we're competing with other publishers, with influencers, with YouTubers on the platform, if you have a strong story, people will tune in. It's just a matter of honing that. So in terms of that, I would say that definitely helps with news content. And the other thing I will mention is in terms of algorithms, it's always tricky, right? Like we never really know, like why did this story do really well on Instagram, but this one didn't? We're sort of always experimenting. But we have noticed with Instagram in particular that there seems to be a higher priority on posts that are shared or saved as opposed to liked. So it's not necessarily the most liked post that's getting pushed out to more people, but if someone's sharing it to their story or sending it to their friend, or saving it for later, that seems to be prioritized, at least based on our anecdotal evidence so far.
Yeah. On the Reddit side, I mean, this is where Reddit, I think, is really different than a lot of other platforms. So obviously, every platform has a certain hand of God aspect to it. It's just part of it. But I would say on Reddit, it's comparatively lighter, specifically for the reason that I mentioned before around the voting. The users are really collectively deciding which content is deemed most popular and then gets seen by the most people. The other thing is that relative to other platforms in particular, Reddit is extremely decentralized because it's organized around these topical communities that are there's going to be a community for people that live in Saskatchewan. There's going to be a community for people that like to bake bread, that like to raise orchids, that are interested in crows, that are interested in left-wing politics, right-wing politics, world news, cute animals, venting about their mothers-in-law, like everything. So in many ways, I would say that we're the perfect antidote to that, because you can get news and news discussion, at great scale on the platform, but you can also, only focus on lifestyle topics or just reading about other people's life problems to make you feel better about your own. I will say that, the content that you see in your home feed is a reflection on the communities that you have joined. So there is an extent to which if you picked only communities that, affirmed your worldview and that were very limited in that way, that is theoretically all that you would see. There are other tabs like the popular feed, which is a survey of what everyone across Reddit likes. Some news in there, also some memes, all of that. But I think that it presents a unique opportunity to service all different aspects of yourself, but to also, glean different perspectives. And another feature that we have on the platform is that for links. If the link is shared in more than one community, there's a little widget that pops up that says view discussions in 5 other communities. It's the only platform that I know where like a CBC link could be posted in 5 different communities that are all having 5 different discussions about the same piece of content because of the theme of those respective communities. And we're essentially encouraging you to go and see all of those different perspectives. And to me, it's really interesting and endlessly fascinating, and I think ultimately healthy that all of those can reside in one place and, you know, interact with each other in various ways and means.
I think bringing it back to one element of your question, which is algorithms designed to distract. There's been a lot of conversation about how different platforms are sort of like designed to keep you on them for as long as possible. That, you know, the thing that feeds all of our industry is the attention economy. And I think one of the things that, you know, TikTok and Netflix in particular does very well is they have built in snap you out of it moments. TikTok will tell you after 2 hours of scrolling that you've been on TikTok for a while. Do you want to wake up? Do you want to leave that trance? We've even developed an entirely new vernacular around binging, doom scrolling, Wikipedia holes. And I think what's going to happen very quickly at this moment is that we're going to see not only like a personal value where you don't want to be stuck on your phone for hours at a time, but the value of your attention after a certain time period is going to create a business value where it doesn't make sense to have somebody in this sort of trance for 5 hours, for 6 hours, for 7 hours. Advertisers don't want to be the 100th ad that you see when you're not even aware of what you're looking at. And I think that is going to really shift things for effective attention, effective content, the most valuable thing that you can offer a reader, because you want them to be alert. You don't want them to be distracted. And I think that that's really going to be the shift that we see in the next few years.
And touching on that idea of value, I think that is so true. And it also really explains why we have seen an incredible appetite for useful, informational content, and actually for news-driven content. I feel like, Anya, part of your question sort of was thinking about news as an afterthought, or informational content as an afterthought to some of these platforms. But it's one of the most exciting content categories that we have on TikTok, and people are really engaged. So from my perspective, you know, I focus on the content. It's not an afterthought at all. It's really integral to the experience, and it's what most of our audiences are really digging into, and why so many news and media brands as a whole are really finding an engaged home on TikTok with some of their content.
I think both of our platforms in many ways cater to, you know, people as, you know, complex, nuanced human beings with a variety of interests. I think this is a few years old, so I don't know if it's still exactly this, but I think it was like 70% of Redditors come to the platform for news, which is a very high number, but also, you know, TikTok and Reddit are neither like the primary station. No one's like, oh, that's like a news platform. Like there's a lot of news on the platform, but it's primarily seen as, you know, a lot of other things. And I think that reflects the diversity of the audience and their interests. I think a lot of, you know, folks like to be, or a lot of platforms or organizations may pigeonhole users into having, you know, being one particular archetype, when in fact people can really surprise you with their, you know, seemingly disparate interests that may even seem incongruous, but ultimately, you know, comprise the whole of who that person is.
Yeah, that's the best part. I mean, people in general, is the ability to surprise, I think, and also of how content evolves, how it explodes on these platforms. And TikTok in particular, it's where, you know, we see trends start as this random 2-second video that you would never have expected turning into this wild global phenomenon. And I think that is so interesting. And what keeps us all hooked is that we don't know where the story is going to go, and it always goes somewhere surprising.
Yeah, curiosity is
sorry.
No, I feel very strongly that, curiosity and the search for knowledge is also at the center of all of these things. Like, you open TikTok, you go to narcity.com because you want to find something new. You want to be engaged. You want to know what are the conversations and the experiences that lie before me in my life. And what the content does, I think, on all of these platforms and with all publishers is it sates that and it serves that. Whether or not people act on it is their personal choice. And I think all we can do is give them the best information possible and acknowledge where that information ends. Knowing what you don't know, knowing what is unverified, and being completely transparent about that is what is going to create a much more invested user or audience member, because they're going to know that there's more to it. There's more to the story, and there's more to the world. And as long as we're tapping into curiosity, then we're all going to be in business, I think.
And I just wanted to ask about one more question that I'll get all of you maybe to give me like your quick take on before we go to audience questions, because I also want to incorporate those. But that's our younger generations, Gen Z, millennials, whatever you want to call it. But are younger news consumers different in how they consume news and what they expect from their news? And Avneet, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So, I've been leading the Snapchat Discover team at CBC News for the past year and a half or so. And I will say in that time, what I've noticed is they are interested in a broad range of stories. It is not just one thing, just like any other audience segment. They are interested in the stories you would expect, stories about young people, a young person doing something amazing, overcoming some sort of hurdle. But then, we've also had success with stories that you wouldn't expect. For example, CBC Marketplace did an investigation last year into nursing home abuse, and we repurposed that story for Snapchat Discover. Now, that story is not one that would immediately strike you as appealing to a younger audience, but it was one of our most successful stories. We led with the fact that this man had put a hidden camera in his mother's nursing home room and caught what happened on camera. And so that sort of lead to that story pulled a lot of people in. So they're definitely interested in a broad range of stories. And like I said before, they want to see themselves reflected. So in that way, I think it's also a mistake to think that they fall for clickbait. They don't. If you promise something in a headline and you don't deliver on it, not only will they, jump out of that article, but they're not coming back. The way to build a loyal user base with a younger audience is to promise something and then actually deliver on it. So that's what we've found with the sort of younger demographic.
Yeah, we actually we have regular weekly, monthly sort of analytics sessions where we break down our readers and we look at what are they reading, what are the trends, and on top of a variety of topics and verticals, what we really find is they want to be taken seriously and they want information in their own language, and that led us to launching a real estate vertical and a money vertical, because there was a dearth of content where you could look at home buying trends, you could look at mortgage rates, you could look at remote job opportunities through a millennial and Gen Z vernacular, and no one else was creating that content for them, because there's a sort of frivolity, I think, that is associated with these generations, that they don't take things seriously. But they really do. They're planning their lives. They're creating a vision for the world, and it includes everything from sticking their tongue out compulsively for some reason. Thank you, TikTok. To figuring out how long it will take for buying their first home.
Yeah, what we see, really honestly though, across audiences of all ages, is the expectation of engagement, like we were talking about earlier, is really having everyone take part in a conversation that's always a two-way sharing of ideas rather than just, sort of placidly consuming media. And also that people are hoping for a really authentic, honest tone. So it feels very conversational. And that's not at all to take away from the quality of the conversation or, the seriousness of the subject matter, but rather just to be, very conversational, very engaging, very authentic, And in terms of the content itself, what we always find really thrives on TikTok is the super niche. So whereas, hyper local journalism might be thriving in some, newsletter formats, what we see on TikTok is these very tight-knit communities that are defined by interest rather than by geography. And so, we have these super engaged sneakerheads or NFT junkies or whatever it might be. And the more specific, the more rooted in that conversation you can be, the more engaged your community is.
Yeah, I think we're seeing, we've always seen a coalescence around communities and folks not wanting to just passively consume information, but really discuss it and dig into it together. I also think that, the new generation of news consumers has more access to information than any previous generation, and they are very confident in, getting their own answers and doing their own research. AMAs, Ask Me Anything sessions are, a foundational part of Reddit culture, and often one of the primary ways that I suggest that journalists start engaging with our audiences. And I've done many of them, so they're all unique flakes of snow in their own way. But people are generally very impressed by the rigor and erudite nature of a lot of the questions that they're being asked. They're like, wow, people really know a lot about these topics and are asking very in-depth questions directly to journalists who want to know more. And I think that type of access is also something that, this generation is more used to. Not to say that they want to have access to the source of every story or every journalist, but I think it's within the realm of expectation that they could get it and that they could be asking these one-to-one questions in a public forum where other people are able to, weigh in. And I think that is a really exciting development, because I think that in many ways they're consistently raising the bar higher for what they expect. And I think that everyone else needs to then, meet that. And that's, I think, can be a really exciting place to be, and it will be fun to see how that develops over the next few years.
And I'm seeing that we have some audience questions coming in, and there's a couple here that it's actually something I was going to ask about, which is the interplay of, traditional news sources and social media. So I was thinking about this, you go to RTDNA and you look at the top posts, and a lot of them are from traditional, it's news that are coming out of traditional broadcasters' websites or from newspapers. So we have a couple of questions here. So one is, does Reddit and TikTok have any rules surrounding taking traditional media stories? Some bloggers on Instagram simply grab content without permission. And then the other one is, I think many reporters' newsrooms have seen TikTok, Reddit as competition, but it appears you believe that mainstream media and social media need each other and need to cooperate to survive and thrive. So I will throw that out to whoever wants to jump in first.
That's a big question.
I know.
So, firstly, I think the first part of the question was about whether you can take somebody's IP. No, certainly not. On TikTok, we have community guidelines that encourage the sharing of only your own original content, definitely. Beyond that, I think there's myriad ways that TikTok specifically and media partners are working together to create incredible content, to create opportunities for storytelling, to reach new audiences. That's the work I do every day, is how we can help the journalists on the platform reach more people and get their stories out to increasingly diverse audiences.
We similarly have a policy against copyright violations, so definitely not allowed. We have a DMCA form that I can send to anyone that needs it, or that is easily accessible on the site, where you file a report of a violation. You can also do it directly on the platform. And again, yeah, we take those seriously, and they are definitely taken down. It's interesting. I think that, news and media organizations and platforms definitely need to find a way to exist together. I think that Reddit and TikTok, probably have different relationships with news and media than some of our, more substantial peers. So not to venture into that too much, but, I think a lot of what my role here at Reddit is to encourage mutual audience development. Reddit has a very substantial audience, of course, but everyone needs to continue to grow. But I think it's a matter of, capitalizing on each other's respective strengths and figuring out how we can engage, each other's audiences in a way that's mutually beneficial. When I work with an AMA with a reporter on an AMA, they're gaining access to sometimes, a community that has 20, 30 million people in it. That's obviously huge, tremendous reach for them. At the same time, using Reddit as a source, using TikTok as a source, like our content being covered by mainstream news outlets is a large part of what allowed us to penetrate into the national discourse and become, a cultural focal point. We rely on each other in that way, I think very much for our platforms in particular. So I don't really see it as competitive in that way, but more so, complementary. Of course, the process of figuring out what exactly that complement looks like needs to be negotiated, I think, on an individual, partner to partner level, because different partners have different needs and priorities. But competitiveness to me implies that there's a zero-sum game going on here, and I don't find that to be the case, especially not with the referral volume that's being sent out. I think that there really is a flow going in both directions.
I agree on the competition point. I will say we definitely don't view TikTok or Reddit as competitors per se. I mean, we're on Reddit. We do AMAs whenever we can. TikTok, we're not currently on yet, but they're platforms that are tools that we can use to reach an audience that we can't reach on our website or on one of our other platforms. So it's definitely an incredible tool for us. So we definitely don't view it as competition in that way.
Yeah, I think it's all about working together. Like nobody's going to disappear. Information is spread throughout the internet, and I think what the things that I think about is like, why did you tell this story? Why did you report this story? Was it to get credit for it? Or was it to introduce this idea and this information into the world? I started my career as a photojournalist in New York City, where there's an infinite amount of competition. And if you're the little guy, you're competing against the New York Times, you're competing against the New York Post. But if you have a unique idea, if you can tell a story that nobody else can tell, then none of that matters, because you're really just competing against yourself. Are you doing your best job as a journalist to tell incredible stories? Maybe you won't get credit for it, but you get to live a life that, is enriching and enjoyable. And, you get to create empathy between people and change public discourse. Isn't that why we do this?
And another question here from the audience. Do you feel the traditional news organizations are putting sufficient resources into new forms of storytelling? Or are they still focused on upgrading, traditional infrastructure and not putting enough attention on new platforms and new storytelling?
I mean, I can speak since I work for CBC, but I would say, I work on the social and audience team, which is a pretty large team, I would say, compared to the amount of resources that some other news organizations dedicate to social. Some news orgs don't even have a social team. They have sort of digital writers also doing social on top of that. So I definitely think like CBC has dedicated a lot to social and digital treatments, and that's not a new thing. It's sort of always the priority that's been there. So yeah, that's what I would say from our perspective.
From my perspective, when I was in journalism years ago, there was this sort of idea that, video, I worked in print journalism and video was the future, and it was going to take, so many resources, and it was too expensive to embark on, and it was really onerous for our teams. And so now I think what's cool is that in TikTok specifically, you can tell these really creative, interesting stories without harnessing necessarily a whole team. If you leverage the really sophisticated in-app features that, the green screen, like you mentioned, Avneet, or all kinds of these interesting effects and features that are built right in, you can tell a really engaging 15-second story without necessarily having to dedicate an entire department. You just have to have a great idea, which is fundamentally what most journalists are doing all day anyways.
I mean, you can't be afraid of change. as a publisher, right? I mean, we've got to be able to tell stories in different mediums, whichever way people are talking about them. And I think, everybody who's still in media after seeing the last 15, 20 years of what's happened, when you hold on tightly to the way things were and when things were stable, you're not going to be around tomorrow if you don't embrace tomorrow.
Yeah, I think change is inevitable. I think it's hard to say all newsrooms are doing well at this or all newsrooms are not. I think that there's a huge variety based on the mindset of the newsroom, based on the resources that are available to them. I do try to position Reddit as something that is not something that can easily fit into day-to-day workflows and that will not actually require a huge amount of effort to get up and running. I think sometimes when you're standing at the bottom of the mountain looking up, it can be very daunting and you're like, oh, do we have the resources to dedicate to this, to really build out a strategy and execute it? And it can feel very intimidating and sometimes easier just to stick to, the ones rather than the ones that you don't. So I think that there's always more work to do there. And that's basically, a huge part of why I exist at the company, to help facilitate that. But I think that we're seeing a lot of innovation coming from newsrooms. And I think that particularly as newsrooms open themselves up to also, interaction directly with audiences, which is something that we've been discussing throughout, the audience will tell you what they want, either directly or indirectly. And I think as long as you're listening to that, it will be much easier to evolve in what feels like a safer way because, you're going in a direction that you've already been asked to go in. Obviously being obstinate is not going to work for anyone over the long term.
Okay, well, I think that we're almost out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. Don't be obstinate. Thank you all very much for making the time to talk to us. It was a really interesting discussion. So thank you, Avneet, Emily, Gabriel, and Catherine. And for those of us who are, and up next in 5 minutes, we are going to have our keynote speaker, Pierre Thomas, who is the senior justice correspondent for ABC News. He'll be speaking with Rashmi Nair from CP24 and taking your questions. But while we get that set up, we're going to hear more from this year's winners of the RTDNA Lifetime Achievement Award. And this group is from the RTDNA Prairie region and West region. Thanks so much.